Not who you would have been if things had gone right. Not the version of yourself untouched by pain, but the self that was shaped, no, sculpted, by every betrayal, every scream that echoed too long, every silent moment when you needed someone and no one came. What if the personality you walk around with isn't your personality at all, but your defense mechanism? You laugh quickly, not because you're always joyful, but because you've learned it keeps people close. You avoid conflict not because you're easygoing, but because you were punished for speaking your truth. You chase achievement not out of ambition, but because it once made you feel worthy, when love was conditional on your success. These aren't quirks. These are survival strategies. And somewhere along the way, survival became identity. But here's the paradox. The very strategies that kept you alive are now the ones keeping you from living. You call it just how I am. But is it? You call it my personality. But whose voice are you echoing? The parent who never saw you? The bully who rewrote your worth? The trauma that whispered, "You are not safe unless you are small"? We like to think of trauma as a singular sharp wound, a moment, a memory, an event. But often it's more like water, silent, constant, dripping. It shapes you not in a single break, but in 1,000 unnoticed erosions. And then one day, you look in the mirror and see not a face, but a mask, perfectly fitted, seamlessly stitched. A mask that smiles, nods, performs, pleases. A mask you forgot you were even wearing. How does this happen? How does pain become identity? And more terrifyingly, if trauma builds the self, who are you without it? You begin to wonder, what parts of me are authentic? What parts of me are adaptive? And can you even tell the difference anymore? Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." But what if your fate was formed at 5 years old? What if the way you love, fear, hide, and strive has nothing to do with choice, and everything to do with wounds you never agreed to receive? The truth is, trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, "Be who they need you to be, not who you are." And that whisper becomes a belief. That belief becomes a behavior. That behavior becomes a personality, and that personality becomes a prison. But if trauma is powerful enough to shape your identity, then is it possible that healing could reshape it? Is there a way back to the self you were before the world told you who to be? That is the great question. Not just what happened to you, but what did you become because of what happened? And perhaps more crucially, can you become something else? Let us walk into the shadows of the psyche, not to dwell in darkness, but to understand how that darkness was cast. Because only when we trace the outline of the mask can we begin to take it off. And beneath it might be someone you've never truly met before. You were born whole, crying loudly, needing freely, expressing without shame. You didn't second-guess your laughter, nor restrain your sadness. You simply were. But then something changed. Maybe it was the look in someone's eyes that taught you your needs were too much. Maybe it was a punishment that arrived when you were honest. Or maybe it was the eerie silence that followed your vulnerability, teaching you, without words, that parts of you were unwelcome. And so, like a sculptor carving away unwanted stone, you began to chip pieces off. Not because you were wrong, but because you were adapting. Adaptation is survival. But over time, it becomes self-erasure. To understand how trauma becomes identity, we must first understand what trauma actually is, not just a single terrifying event, but any experience that overwhelms the nervous system and leaves the psyche no choice but to reshape itself around pain. Psychologist Gabor Mate puts it simply, "Trauma is not what happens to you. It is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. And what happens inside you is often invisible, a contraction of the self, a distortion of truth. a rewiring of how you love, relate, and even remember. You begin to live inside a blueprint you didn't design. From a Jungian perspective, this fragmentation becomes part of the shadow, the unconscious reservoir of all the aspects of ourselves we were told not to be. These shadows don't disappear, they don't dissolve, they hide and influence us from behind the veil. In the absence of wholeness, the psyche finds stability in falsehood. It creates a false self, a persona, that appears acceptable, functional, even admirable. The overachiever, the caretaker, the comic relief, the perfectionist. All these roles are armor, but armor is heavy. And after years of wearing it, you begin to believe it is your skin. This is the hidden problem. You confuse adaptation with authenticity. Nietzsche warned us of this in his reflections on becoming what we behold. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. But what if the monster is not external, but a role you created to defend yourself? And what if this role is now devouring the real you? Psychologically, this process is known as identification, where we merge so completely with our adaptations that they no longer feel like choices. The child who was ignored becomes the adult who fears being a burden. The teenager who was shamed becomes the adult who hides behind humor. The survivor becomes the performer, and then forgets they are performing. And here lies the philosophical dilemma. Is identity a discovery or a construction? If your sense of self is based on unconscious responses to pain, what does that say about your freedom? About your agency? Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself." But what if you were made before you ever had a choice? In that case, healing is not just emotional work. It's philosophical rebellion. To reclaim the self, you must confront the uncomfortable truth that many of your preferences, beliefs, and habits were not truly chosen. They were inherited from trauma. The cost of survival was authenticity, and the bill has now come due. Even neuroscience supports this. Trauma rewires the brain's pathways. The amygdala becomes hypervigilant. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought and self-awareness, can shut down under chronic stress. The body keeps the score, as Bessel van der Kolk says, and it keeps writing the same chapter over and over again. Until you realize you're not living your life. You're repeating your trauma. But what's most sinister about this cycle is that it's hidden. You don't walk around saying, "I am the product of unresolved trauma." You say, "I'm just not good with intimacy." You don't say, "My nervous system was shaped by neglect." You say, "I just prefer being independent." You don't say, "I fear rejection so deeply that I perform perfection." You say, "I just have high standards." The mask becomes language, the language becomes narrative, and the narrative becomes a cage you decorate, calling it home. But if trauma can shape identity from the shadows, what else might be hiding there? What unlived lives? What unfelt emotions? What forgotten desires? There's a part of you buried beneath the roles you play. It's quiet, patient, watching, and perhaps it's time to meet them. You walk through life thinking you're making choices. Where to live, who to love, what to pursue. But what if most of these choices are made for you, long before you're even conscious of choosing? Not by fate, not by genetics, but by pain. By the unhealed wound that whispers from behind every decision. Be safe, be accepted, be invisible, be good. You don't notice the whisper at first. It sounds like intuition. It sounds like common sense. It sounds like you, but it isn't. It's the survival strategy you mistook for a personality, and now it guides your entire existence. This is the most insidious consequence of trauma-based identity. You confuse protection with purpose. You think you're chasing dreams when really you're avoiding triggers. You think you're being kind when really you're terrified of being disliked. You think you're independent when really you've simply given up on being understood. And so, your life becomes a carefully edited performance, tailored to avoid abandonment, rejection, humiliation, or shame. The irony? The more you perform to be loved, the less truly loved you feel, because deep down, you know, they're loving the mask, not the self. This leads to a hollow sort of loneliness. You could be surrounded by people, even admired, and still feel profoundly unknown, because you are, even to yourself. Trauma isn't just a psychological phenomenon, it's a neurological loop. Each time you encounter something that remotely resembles the original wound, criticism, disapproval, disconnection, your brain lights up like an old battlefield. The amygdala sends danger signals. Cortisol floods the body. Your nervous system prepares for war, even when there is no enemy. And so, you withdraw. You lash out. You shut down. You appease. You call it overreacting. But in truth, it's reliving. Each moment of fear becomes not just a reaction, but a reenactment. And the worst part? You don't even realize it's happening, because the trauma script is written in the language of normalcy. Culturally, this gets reinforced. In a society that rewards productivity over presence, perfection over authenticity, independence over intimacy, trauma isn't just common, it's canonized. The anxious overachiever is praised. The emotionally avoidant is seen as cool. The chronically selfless are called good people. No one stops to ask what's being buried beneath those traits. What fear, what grief, what longing. And so, the trauma-formed identity isn't just tolerated, it's glorified. You might even be admired for your wounds as long as you hide them well. But here's the catch. What you repress doesn't disappear. It mutates. Unfelt grief becomes irritability. Unspoken needs become resentment. Repressed rage becomes exhaustion, depression, autoimmune illness. The body begins to carry what the psyche cannot say, and slowly, your life contracts. Your world shrinks to avoid discomfort. Your relationships revolve around keeping the peace. Your passions dim under the weight of realistic expectations. You start calling your numbness maturity, your avoidance wisdom, your silence strength. But these are not virtues. They are scars. We must confront a terrifying truth. Most people die never having met themselves. They live through roles, parent, partner, professional, each one another mask in a long line of disguises. And beneath it all, a self they abandoned long ago in exchange for acceptance, approval, survival. You may begin to wonder, have I ever made a free choice? Or have I only ever chosen between the prisons I was taught to tolerate? The consequences of trauma-based identity aren't loud. They don't announce themselves like crises. They creep in like fog, blurring the edges of who you are until you mistake the gray for clarity. And so, you become what the world needed you to be. But what if you asked for once, what do I need to be? Not to survive, but to be whole. The next section will offer a doorway. But for now, pause here. Feel the weight of the performance. Notice the masks you wear so naturally they've become invisible. And remember, the most dangerous prison is the one you don't know you're in. To heal is not to return to who you were. It is to strip away who you were never meant to be. The rebellion begins in silence. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a quiet moment when you stop pretending. You're sitting at the edge of your bed, or walking home after another day of being fine, and suddenly, something breaks. Not loudly, but finally. You whisper the question that shifts everything. What if I don't want to do this anymore? Not just the job or the relationship, but the role itself, the strong one, the nice one, the achiever, the peacemaker. What if you no longer want to be the version of yourself that pain demanded? That's where the rebellion starts, not with violence but with honesty. For so long, your life has been a performance. But rebellion is about remembering, you are not the role. You are the actor. And the script can be rewritten. Begin small. You don't have to tear down your whole life. But you do have to stop lying. Stop saying yes when you mean no. Stop laughing when you want to cry. Stop apologizing for taking up space. This sounds simple, but it isn't. Because when trauma has written your identity, authenticity feels dangerous. Being real might trigger guilt, or fear, or shame. Because the last time you were real, it cost you something: love, safety, dignity. But you are no longer that child. You are no longer powerless. And healing begins the moment you realize this. Carl Jung taught us that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But he also warned, to become yourself, you must pass through your shadow. What does that mean? It means facing the parts of you you've buried, the rage you called unreasonable, the sadness you numbed, the longing you deemed too much. Healing is not about becoming more palatable. It's about becoming more whole. You won't always be graceful. Sometimes healing looks like screaming into a pillow. Sometimes it looks like ending a relationship. Sometimes it looks like resting when your inner critic is screaming to keep going. You have to unlearn survival. This is perhaps the most difficult part, because survival worked. It protected you, but what saved you then is now suffocating you. To unlearn survival is to do the opposite of what your trauma taught you. Speak when you were told to be silent. Rest when you were taught to prove yourself. Ask when you were conditioned to never need. Be seen when invisibility once kept you safe. Each act of authenticity becomes an act of resistance. But here's a truth few tell you. Healing hurts. Not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. Because it means confronting the grief of who you could have been. It means mourning the years lost to masks, to roles, to pretending. But grief is sacred. It means you're no longer numb. It means you care enough to feel. And in that feeling, something ancient stirs. The original self. The version of you that existed. Before you adapted. Before you fractured. Before you learned that love must be earned and needs must be hidden. This self has not been destroyed, only buried. And it waits. Not for perfection, but for permission. Viktor Frankl, survivor of Auschwitz, once said, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." But perhaps the deepest challenge is this: to change back into what we were, before the world changed us. That doesn't mean regressing. It means remembering. Who you were when you felt safe being curious. Who you were when you danced without watching. Who you were before the world told you who to be. And then choose that self. Again and again. Not because it's easy, but because it's true. This rebellion is not loud. It does not seek vengeance. It seeks return. To the voice that was silenced. To the child that was shamed. To the self that was forgotten. And every day you choose truth over performance, wholeness over hiding, presence over pretending. You reclaim something that never should have been taken. You. There comes a moment in healing, not dramatic but sacred, when you no longer ask, "What happened to me?" Instead, you ask, "Who am I now that I'm no longer pretending?" At first, the question feels hollow. You stare at it like a stranger. But then, something echoes inside. Quiet at first, like wind moving through an abandoned house. And in that echo, you feel something strange. Not fear, not grief. Space. The space once occupied by false selves, by armor, by roles you played so long they became skin. Now that skin is shedding, and what remains? A mystery, but not a terrifying one. A sacred one. The ultimate truth is not that trauma shaped you. That much is already known. The ultimate truth is that you are not your trauma. You never were. You are not the anger, not the silence, not the mask. Those were chapters, but they are not your story. Your story is what remains when those chapters close. And here's the truth few dare to believe. The self that trauma buried is still alive, not ruined, not erased, but waiting. Waiting beneath the noise of performance, waiting beneath the defenses of your nervous system, waiting beneath the fear that if you are real, you will be unloved. This self is not polished, it is raw, unedited, it stutters when it speaks, it trembles when it hopes, but it is real, and in its reality, there is power. You've spent years mastering survival, but now, you are learning how to live. Not as a function of fear, not as a response to the past, but as a return to the present. That's the final realization. Healing is not becoming someone new. It's unbecoming everything you were never meant to be. The shame, inherited, the guilt, implanted, the fear, absorbed, let it all fall away. Because beneath all that weight is the person you were always meant to become. Not perfect, but whole. You may always carry the imprint of what you endured. The body remembers, the psyche remembers. But now, you remember something greater. You are not your past. You are your presence, and in that presence lives choice. Not the illusion of choice shaped by fear, but true choice rooted in truth. You can choose honesty over appeasement, boundaries over guilt, stillness over performance, love over armor. You can choose to stay, to speak, to feel, to be. The final truth? Your identity is not static, it's sacred, and it's yours to reclaim, not for approval, not for validation, but because you were always worthy of living as your whole self. And maybe, just maybe, the pain wasn't a detour. Maybe it was a doorway, because who better to embody authenticity than the one who had to fight for it? Who better to teach wholeness than the one who once felt fractured? Who better to live truthfully than the one who knows the cost of lies? So now, here you stand, at the threshold of your truest life, not the one shaped by fear or shame or silence, but the life that begins when you look in the mirror, remove the mask, and whisper, "There you are, I've missed you."